Confetti Covered Quicksand, Chapter 3. Feel like meeting a prince in Europe? I had a good friend named Bertie Montgomery. I met her in Hollywood. She was 3 years younger than me and really, really pretty. She was so pretty that it sucked because I felt ugly next to her. She was always impeccably groomed with long, beautiful caramel hair in big, loose curls, perfect makeup application, and a cloud of Chanel perfume around her. She kind of looked like a young Jessica Alba with huge boobs. She had sort of a snobby air about her, and she was quite prissy. Bertie and I were partners in crime on the Sunset Strip during the hairband time period, and now we were both drifting off into a different territory, the L.A. club scene. It was chock full of celebrities, drugs, and general shadiness. It was really one of the worst places for a girl like Bertie to be. She was 16 and bold, not afraid of anything, and very curious. I had slightly more sense than her, so I was often unable to relax when I was with her, because I had to watch out for her. She was always getting into trouble, and not just typical teenage girl trouble. A good example of this was one of the nights I snuck out of the house in order to go to Bar 1 with her. Heidi Fleiss, a former Hollywood madam, was in jail at the time, but that didn't stop her boyfriend, Ivan, and some other junior apprentice from taking over her business right there at Bar 1. The junior apprentice was named Lori. She had on light makeup, shoulder-length, nondescript hair, and was dressed very casually in an understated white t-shirt and jeans. I guess that was rule number 1 of the Madam Handbook, don't be too flashy. Well, she did a good job of it. She was actually very forgettable, but incredibly confident. In hindsight, I think she was really just coke confident, something I have seen all too much of in the years since then. It's when somebody, after doing a few lines of cocaine, is a little too pleased with themselves. They find themselves fascinating and they won't shut the fuck up because everything seems like such a great idea. One feels indestructible like a superhero. Everywhere they go is the place to be and everything they do is the thing to do. Yep, coke confident is what she was. She talked a little too much, and she bragged far more than was necessary, and generally had all of the other aforementioned traits. She seemed sort of juvenile. She was clearly new at what she was doing. Anyway, I was too fat at the time, thank God, but Bertie was a perfect specimen of beauty and youth. They spotted her straight away, and they approached her for the hard sell. Their technique was based on the fairy tale dreams of most young girls, finding Prince Charming. They told her they had some prince lined up for her to meet, and they wanted to send her to Switzerland, where he was staying, in order to meet him. They said she was his type, he would just love her, and who knows, she could end up marrying him. They said she didn't have to do anything she didn't want to do, and it was all her call. At the very least, she could enjoy Europe and see the sights and whatnot. I wouldn't have believed them from the jump because it sounded a little too good to be true, but the truth was that I recognized Ivan from the news. I knew he was an accomplice of Heidi's. They were open about it. I think I asked them, I can't remember, but they were open about taking over the business for the time being. Lori said she didn't see it as something bad. She considered herself a matchmaker. She said she was there to set up the right people, and if love, marriage, and the title of Crown Prince came later, then all the better. Bertie sat there listening and looked at me, locking pupils with me. It was a look of hers that I knew too well. It meant, I know this is going to get me into some trouble somehow, but it sounds adventurous. My look, one that I was having to bust out more often than I wanted to, said, oh no, girl, oh no. We went and huddled in a sidebar conference. She said she knew it sounded crazy, but wouldn't it be fun to go to Europe on their dime? And the prince, what if he really did like her? Well, I forbade her to go. I said it was one thing to get in trouble here in town, but I wouldn't let her leave the country by herself. It was too dangerous. I couldn't watch over her. She would be alone. What if she ended up missing or sold into sex slavery or something? Never seen again. I was sure I'd heard a story or two about girls being sold into slavery or something equally awful, Lots of LA girls had gone over to the Sultan of Brunei during that time, and the rumors were not pretty. I reminded Bertie that she still lived with her parents. What was she going to tell them? Hey, I'm going to Switzerland. I'll be back later. Well, I saw the wheels turning in her head. She went back to Laurie and said she wanted to go, but on one condition. They had to let me come with her. They looked over at me. I was not only fat, but I was wearing a fucking beret that night. And they reluctantly agreed. I was like, wait, can we discuss this? I did not have a good feeling about it, but thought that maybe with my street smarts we could somehow finagle out of any danger. Ivan and Laurie were so smitten with Bertie that they wanted to wine and dine her and her fat beret-wearing friend as part of the deal. They took us to some restaurant in Beverly Hills, and as we were getting out of the car with them, a bunch of paparazzi started snapping pictures. Heidi Fleiss was a big news item at the time. The whole thing had just happened. So anyone who was connected to her was just news. I put out my hand to block the picture. I did not want my face in the same frame as those two. Shit. I was pissed, but I held my tongue. Once we got inside the restaurant and got settled, they continued their pitch on Bertie. They reiterated how glamorous it would be for her in Europe and how she could end up marrying royalty and spending the rest of her life in couture. She half listened to them, but she seemed more interested in dipping her $20 fries into ketchup. After the dinner, we piled into their silver Range Rover, and Laurie put on the Nine Inch Nails song Closer, which I don't even think was released to the public yet, and she sang along in a really intense and showy way. It was all very coquish, a word I had to invent just now to describe such antics. They told us they were bringing us back to Heidi's place to party. Heidi's place? Fuck, I thought. Then I remembered she was in jail. Ugh. I guess it's not a big deal just to go to her house. Go to her house if she's not even going to be there, right? Well, I was a bit drunk, as I always was, but I remember seeing a marble foyer and a marble bathroom with gold faucets that I promptly used to pee in. When I was done with the bathroom, I joined them in a boardroom type of room with a very long table surrounded by chairs. I wondered if they held executive meetings or something. It all looked so official. Ivan said he had to fax Heidi something and excused himself to the fax machine. She was allowed to use a fax machine in prison? I looked at Laurie, her big mouth yapping away at Bertie, who looked bored. I wondered if Heidi purposely brought Laurie in to continue the business, or if she took over because there was an opening. At that moment, Bertie was done listening and ready to start talking. I looked over with amusement to hear what would come out of her mouth. I'm going to need a car. I can't even get anywhere, so this wouldn't work for me. I straightened my posture and I looked around. Where was she going with this? Ivan did not miss a beat. He said there was a car downstairs that she could have. She asked if it was a stick because she could only drive an automatic. He said it was indeed a stick, but if you can back it out of the driveway, it's yours. And by the way, he had some kind of Hungarian accent, not like the one I just used. We all got up. We went to the driveway to see a beat-up brown Hyundai. I almost choked on my spit. What the fuck kind of car was that? What happened to the Range Rover? I expected there to be at least a BMW or at the very least a nice Toyota down there, but no. A dog-shit brown Hyundai sat there, full of dust. Maybe it was the equivalent of wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Maybe it was to draw less attention, or maybe it was the maids or something, or someone's car that they sent off into slavery and never showed up again. Well, before I could even figure that out, Bertie was in the driver's seat and Ivan and Laurie were standing by the car. She turned it on. She tried working the clutch and the stick shift. The car jerked all over the place, and I started to giggle. I couldn't help myself. She kept trying to concentrate, and everybody was all serious. I put my hands over my mouth to stifle my laughter. The sight of her in that car was hilarious, and then the fact that she couldn't even reverse the thing out of the driveway was even more awesome. Needless to say, she didn't get the car, and eventually I talked her out of going to Europe. One night, Charlotte received news of a death in the family, and it had affected her terribly. She was screaming and crying. I stayed in my room. I didn't know the proper thing to do. I didn't want to do or say the wrong thing. I decided that I should leave and let her be alone with her friends and her family that were coming over to mourn. I figured the last thing she needed was me there, somebody who annoyed her so much, but it turned out staying in your room and saying nothing at all is rude, and so is trying to leave. She was offended that I was leaving and started screaming at me. She screamed I couldn't go anywhere until I cleaned the den. I knew she was going through a rough time, so I didn't engage her in an argument. I just said, "Later," and burst out the front door. I am sure I wasn't cutting it, and I'm sure I did a terrible job and was rude. I had no manners to speak of, and I was surely offensive to the family. And I probably had no idea how lazy I was being and how little housework I was actually doing. I was getting free room and board, and I really did have some nerve coming home at all hours in the morning, hungover to take care of a child the next day. I really should have been more grateful and worked a lot harder. But I was too young and foolish to understand. I didn't know the correct behavior during her time of grievance. I didn't know to say, "I am so sorry," or "Is there anything I can do?" or just help out by taking Elizabeth aside so she could mourn. I really wish I had handled that differently. I never touched anyone or hugged anyone or offered sympathy or had any empathy myself. I was a very cold person, and I had been for some time. I just didn't know how to be warm with people. There was no reason to, with the hard crowd I was hanging out with in my teenage years. It was about mid-December in 1993, and I was working with hot Sean Peterson a lot. He was playing the role of Big Brother, listening to my problems regarding my living situation. He was renting a huge house off of Topanga Canyon, which was over the hill from Malibu, with some of the guys from work. I had partied there several times, and I knew the guys who lived there pretty well. Sean said I could stay with them if need be. The door was always open, and just to come on over if I ever needed to. The night I left my job as a nanny, I drove straight to his house. I felt great relief being out of Charlotte and George's house. Then it hit me. I was going to be living with 4 dudes, and at first I was worried about looking pretty. I thought, I can't let these guys see me without my makeup. But I knew it would be a very small price to pay to have a roof over my head. My new neighborhood was a sleepy area filled with dripping trees and hidden homes. It was sprinkled with miniature restaurants, tiny boutique shops, and a little general store. Sean's place was set very far back from the street at the end of a long driveway. You couldn't even see the house from the street. It was hidden by trees. The place had hardwood floors and barely any furniture, so it echoed. It had a step-down dining room and a large tile kitchen with a balcony that jetted out over rooftops and trees below. The backyard was on a hillside. There was a pool and lots of white Greek statues and pillars, a thatched-roof tiki bar with sinks, and a bench in the very back underneath a huge, shaggy pepper tree where people sat and smoked pot. The yard was gaudy and fabulous, downright perfect for a bunch of 20-somethings. Everyone liked to stand on the patio at night and drink beers while looking out over the twinkling lights of the San Fernando Valley. I slept on the scratchy living room couch with some blankets. I remember always being cold and hoping I didn't get scabies, which is always the worry of someone sleeping on a party couch. I had a cheap drugstore alarm clock to wake me up from my shifts at Pow Pow. One of the girls at work who I normally hated, Courtney Salzberg, brought me a beautiful and plush goose-down comforter to use. I was very grateful, and I never forgot it, even though she and I fought later on down the line. I could never really hate her because she was kind enough to let me have that luxury from her home. As for the 4 guys I was to live with, there was Sean. He was still an aspiring actor and still had huge light blue eyes, tan skin, longish dark blonde hair, and a hot face. I shook my head like there were marbles in it to stop myself from thinking about him. Posing nude in Playgirl. Luckily, he took on a paternal role. He announced to the others that I would be staying with them as long as I needed to. Then there was a guy named Anthony Rivera, who was an employee at another Pow Pow location, but partied with everyone at the Encino location. He was a short, funny, gay Latin guy who had slicked back hair. He was really crazy, so I hung out with him a lot. He was a good 5 or 6 years older than me and the rest of us, and he sold cocaine out of the other location's takeout area. The code word was something like, "I'll have a diet soda," and he would sell you a bindle. He got so into it, one time somebody really did want a diet soda, and they got some cocaine instead. Back to the story. My 3rd roommate was a tall German named Tim Schmidt. He was outgoing and smart with big, soft blonde curls in his hair, blue eyes, and wire-rimmed glasses. He was not my type, but he got chicks. We partied together a lot. He dressed like sort of a hippie. He wore patchouli and he smoked pot. He was really, really into music, mainly anything that was played at Lollapalooza, and he had lots of paisley and Indian print stuff in his room. Lucas Hoffman was the fourth guy who lived there. He had long, straight blonde hair and sort of a pug nose. Chicks dug him because he looked like a rocker, but I had had enough of that look. Lucas rarely spoke. I swear he may have said 10 words the whole time I knew him. Anthony always made jokes about how hot Lucas was, so Lucas tried to get him to clean his room and shit. Anthony would say, "This Mexican does not run after you, white boy." Sean, Tim, Lucas, and I lived in the main house, and Anthony lived in a little guest house off of the garage. And that was good because he would blast Wham so loud that the neighbors would call the cops. He was reading a lot of Anne Rice at the time, so he named his new kitten Lestat. Lestat was a little black fluff ball who Anthony insisted was gay. He would say, "Move your tail to the left if you're straight, and to the right if you're gay, Lestat." And the little pile of puff would, lo and behold, move his tail to the right. One day I was taking out the trash and I lifted up the trash can lid. Something was rustling deep inside the trash can. I dug underneath some trash and I found a Kentucky Fried Chicken box that was completely closed, yet moving around. I was like, "Lestat, is that you?" I opened the box and there was Lestat full of grease and licking his chops. He was so gross from the trash can, I had to carry him by the scruff of his little neck. Then he farted. I shut my eyes and I shook my head and I brought him to Anthony. Anthony took him and dunked him in the pool and scrubbed him. One day, Sean decided that I should have an actual room instead of sleeping on that couch. The guys all helped to build a wall across the wide dining room, complete with a door. I was impressed that they even knew how to do it. After a month or so, another of our co-workers moved into the house to cut our rent down. His name was Blake Martin, and he was maybe a year younger than me. He was tall and handsome from certain angles. He looked a little bit like a young Tim Robbins. He was always doing really unfunny Jerky Boys and Beavis and Butthead imitations, and he usually annoyed the shit out of me because he acted very pretentious. He was always bragging about things and acting cocky. I had to be nice to him, though, because he was the only one with a TV in the damn house, and he kept it locked in his room. That was the type of guy he was. Blake had this little girlfriend named Ursula, who looked no older than 10. I relentlessly made fun of him for dating her. He said he was with her because her family had money. Then he proceeded to put me down for not having any. He said he could never date me because I was too blue-collar and I had split ends and my nails were not in good shape. No one had ever said that to me before. That must have been why I hadn't attracted the hot waiters at Pow Pow. I looked blue-collar? What did that mean exactly? Blake was a source of hurt and also someone I wanted to conquer. And as the months went on, I started falling for him. Ugh, I was so mad at myself. We had a full-blown affair, and I told no one. I could not let Anthony find out because he thought Blake was such a tool, and he thought I agreed. The problem was, I did think he was a tool, a hot tool. Maybe one of those hot welding irons or something. Regardless of my bad judgment, his comments really affected me. A pretty girl named Molly was hired at Pow Pow around that time. She was a beautiful sorority girl who was also very kind. I didn't know if she came from a well-off family. Her manners led me to believe she did, even if her car was a total clunker. She was tall and thin with the face of an angel, an upturned nose, pouty lips, huge childlike eyes, and long, shiny golden hair. She did not need a drop of makeup. She never looked down on me, and she was friendly to all of the guys in the house, who were falling all over themselves when she came over to hang out with me. She was so gorgeous that even Lestat had a crush on her. He lay on his back and he looked up at her, and she put her face down toward him to coo at him, and he looked into her eyes and he put his paw on her cheek and stared at her. It was the weirdest thing. And even stranger than that, when she tried to go home, he jumped onto her windshield. He wouldn't get off of her car. He didn't want her to leave. She kept laughing and saying, "Lestat, I have to go. I will come back and see you, okay?" He was in love. It was no shock that she put him under a spell. I pictured her with cartoon birds fluttering around her and a deer at her feet as she sang in the forest and shit. Molly was so sweet that it was a huge shock to all of us when all she wanted to do was smoke everyone's weed. One day Tim was at home and she suggested we go through all of his things and find his stash. I shrugged and said, "All right, why not?" We looked through all of his hippie stuff, and sure enough, she found a baggie inside some Indian box. We sat right there in his patchouli-scented room and smoked all of his shit. She told me about dating a famous musician when she was 13 years old, along with a lot of other interesting stuff. I found her very fascinating. After we got stoned, we went into my room. I had magazine covers taped to the wall, and she very nicely and gently made a suggestion to me. "Why don't you frame those? Find some really cute frames and paint them white." She said they would look a lot better that way. I confided in her about my lack of knowledge in the area of decorating and good taste in general. Being stoned, I added in that I was embarrassed I didn't have any clothes of good quality. She went to my closet. She looked at the 4 or 5 poorly made outfits I owned. She looked at the labels, which were very inexpensive brands, and suggested I cut the tags off. After she left, I fell into my bed and put my feet on the wall. I felt a little saddened. I suddenly understood what Blake was saying. I was trashy. I didn't know how to decorate. I didn't own nice clothing. My heart sank. It was as if I had been walking around in public with toilet paper on my foot. I had never entertained the thought that I was seen as someone from a lower social class than others. I didn't even ever consider that one's belongings or one's grooming showed such things. It was another part of life that hurt me, but I knew it was something I couldn't stop. The judgment of others would always be there. I had been riding on my looks through my teenage years. Social class was completely null and void. Just the idea of the words white trash and blue collar, I didn't even know how to get my head around it. I knew something had to be done, I just didn't know what. For the most part, we got along pretty well in the house, but there was a little bit of tension between the responsible, Sean, and the irresponsible, Anthony. Anthony felt Sean was looking down on him for drinking and partying so much, and he was right. Sean was disgusted by Anthony's drug and alcohol abuse, but he let him move in because he needed another person to cover the rent on that huge house. I understood how Anthony felt because Sean could stare at you and make you feel like shit. Sean pulled me aside one day at work. He asked me how much I made a year, and I told him it was about $6,000. He told me that was below the poverty line. He asked me what I wanted to do with my life, and I didn't have an answer. I told him I used to be ambitious as a kid, but at that point in my life, I was just trying to survive. He grilled me a little bit. He said I needed a dream, something to shoot for. I told him my family was all jacked up and I had no support and there was no way I could amount to something. Sean told me something that I never forgot. He told me a story about identical twins that grew up in really poor, shitty, abusive circumstances. One grew up a bum who was addicted to drugs, and the other grew up to be a very successful millionaire. They were both asked why they had turned out the way they did. And Sean looked at me with a serious look on his face and he said, and they both gave the same answer. It was because of the way I was raised. His concern made me uncomfortable. I didn't want to deal with bettering myself. I ignored his advice and I sided with Anthony, who talked behind Sean's back and made fun of him. I had no loyalty. It was as if he had never helped me, never taken me in when I was in need. He eventually moved out to get away from us losers. He told me I could take his old room, the master bedroom. It was the coolest room because it had its own bathroom and a sliding glass door to the pool. The other 3 guys had to share a bathroom, and Anthony had his own in the guest house. Anthony started working for a movie production company around then as an assistant director. There was a lot of downtime between projects, so he was often laying around the house and drinking beers. He often told me hilarious stories about his dates or tricks. One time he went home with some old bones, as he called them, to try and make some rent money, but all the guy did was buy him some Kentucky Fried Chicken for payment, which he apparently still liked to eat, and then dump him back off on the street. Anthony looked at me with his eyebrows up and a Coors Light in his hand. He said, "It was extra crispy, girl, extra crispy." He talked about going home with guys after the clubs. He would often steal their cologne bottles, their hats, or other trinkets when they went to take a shower after hooking up with him. He had a huge cologne collection, and needless to say, the fucker always smelled good. If Anthony saw a hot waiter when we were out to eat, he always took his napkin, tucked it in his shirt, grabbed his knife and fork and said, "Lunch." Or if there were young, hot high school guys, he said, "School is out." I was very amused by him and found myself laughing more than usual. Sometimes he went into the bathroom and ratted his slicked-back hair out into a huge afro, standing a foot off of his head in all directions. Then he would come into a room where I was reading or something, and he would put his hand on his chest and say, "Ooh, girl, I got shocked real good," and pretend he had been electrocuted and out of breath and thankful to be alive. I always got a kick out of that. Random people and animals were always walking through the front door of the Topanga house, which was never locked. When a pizza delivery boy came to the door, Anthony always dragged him inside and gave him beers. One day, I was sitting there reading, and 2 dogs ran right past me in the living room and out to the backyard. I just went back to reading my book. Another time, Anthony was lying by the pool, and he felt somebody staring at him. He put down his interview magazine and saw that a drooling black Rottweiler was just sitting there staring at him. There was always something crazy happening at that house.